just kind of get started because my first question is going to be asking our two guests to introduce themselves. Sorry, what oh, okay. All right. But I will just say that Noel Nash and Tim Gleason are our guests today. Noel owns the Chronicle, which is a publication in Springfield with South Lane County communities. And then Tim Gleason is a professor emeritus at the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communications. But that's all I'm going to share. I'll let you guys do the rest. So Noel, we'll start with you, and Tim, you'll answer the same question, but I'll just go through these series of questions and then we'll open it up to the group. Here, I'll hit that, sorry. All right, so can you introduce yourself and provide a brief overview of your experiences in the field of journalism and local news?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having us here today. I've started my career in print newspapers in 1983. I was a native of Miami, Florida, and I got a job at the Miami News, which was the afternoon newspaper in Miami, along with the Miami Herald, the morning paper. They had a JOA, a joint operating agreement, so we shared the same building and the same presses and slightly different editorial philosophy. And from Miami, I got a job at the Palm Beach Post, and from there I moved up to Jacksonville, Florida, and from there to the Gainesville Sun, where the University of Florida is, and that paper was owned by the New York Times Company. It was part of 32 newspapers in the southeastern United States owned by the Times, including a couple in Alabama. And from Gainesville, I went to Alabama, Northwest Alabama. I'd spent most of my career at that point in sports, and when I got to the paper up near Muscle Shoals, the Florence Times Daily, I became the managing editor. So I was responsible for oversight of everything in the newspaper, editorially. From there, I went out to Provo, Utah to work for the Pulitzer Company and help prepare for the Winter Olympics in 2002. That, of course, turned into the first international event following 9/11, which turned it into much more than just a sporting event. Although the Olympics already are much more than a sporting event, but that was an especially odd time and a weird event to cover. About a year after that, I ended up at the Dallas Morning News, back in sports, overseeing coverage of the Dallas Cowboys, Texas Rangers baseball, golf. And 3.5 years after that, I ended up at ESPN and Disney. ESPN wanted to create a startup within its business that is responsible for all clock, score, and statistics, any forward-facing data on any platform around the world for the sports they cover. And I was hired to help create that group. That was the data group, turned into the stats and information group. And 230 people working globally to manage the data and the information, the research, the tidbits, the news that comes out of ESPN. In 2017, I left ESPN. I missed journalism, newspaper journalism specifically. I felt like I had a front row seat to watching the demise of it in many cases. And I believe that there was still tremendous value in a hyper-local newspaper, telling stories about your family, your friends, your neighbors, and the impact that you have in communities. And I thought that communities in particular that didn't have any other media covering them were ripe for the opportunity to go in and serve them with hyper-local news and information. So in 2019, I purchased the Cresswell Chronicle. We renamed it to the Chronicle. 2 years ago, we moved our offices to Springfield. We expanded our coverage to Springfield, Cresswell, Cottage Grove, and Pleasant Hill. And the idea is to tell the stories of the people who live in these communities every day and make a difference. And we cover 5 different high schools and 4 different school districts. It's a lot to do, but we love it and we think there's tremendous value there. And I'll stop there. Sorry.
Well, it's kind of hard to follow that. Well, I'm Tim Gleason, and I was a a brief overview, I was a reporter and photographer on Eastern Long Island primarily for a very long time, a very, very, very long time ago. Ended up in graduate school at the University of Washington, had a PhD in communication law at the University of Washington, taught at the University of Utah for 1 year, came to Oregon in 1987, and have been here ever since. I was the dean of the School of Journalism and Communication for 16 years. I was the university's faculty athletic representative for 7 or 8 years. I'm married to Jenny Ullum and known to many of you as her husband. My background, I guess I should note, and it was noted in the bio that was on the website, I was on the board of directors of the Oregon Newspaper Publishers Association for, I don't know, 15 years or so, and on the Oregon Association of Broadcasters for a number of years as well, and served on the Open Oregon Board, which is a not-for-profit organization dedicated to open government and public records, and have a fairly deep background in Oregon journalism. I want to just kind of give you 3 themes that I think are important for this discussion, and one is that I think that play into what Noel was talking about. One is that there's an economic crisis in the news business, trying to figure out how do we fund journalism? How do we make sure that communities have a healthy journalistic presence and people reporting on what's going on in the community? We also have a trust crisis. As with most large organizations and institutions, the public does not have the level of trust that they should have, that we need to create in journalism and in the journalistic product. And then we have what we can call a news desert crisis, which is to say that it's actually, there's something like 70 million people in the United States who don't have access to any local journalism product. No newspaper, no nothing. And I think we can say in this community, given what has happened to the Register Guard in the last 15 years, we live in something of a news desert. With all due respect and admiration for what the Weekly does, what KLCC does, what the Chronicle does, we still have, if you look at the number of journalists working in Oregon today, as opposed to the number of journalists working in Oregon 10 years ago, it's probably something like a third of the number of people. If you combine all the newsrooms currently operating in Lane County, we wouldn't even be close to what the Register Guard had when it was a real newspaper. And that's a crisis for all of us. It's a civic health crisis that we really do need to figure out how to address. And I will say that the Chronicle and other operations that are in Oregon that are working hard are doing their best to cover what they can with the resources available.
Great. Well, thank you both for those intros. And so, Noel, you touched a bit on the term hyper-local news. So I'm assuming folks kind of understand what that really is, and maybe you could just kind of give us a little definition. But I'm going to ask both of you, what in your view sets hyper-local news apart from broader other news, and why is it so critical for communities?
So to me, hyperlocal news takes what is a commodity and turns it into something truly unique and differentiated in terms of its content. USA Today can write a story about any national medical trend that probably has some connection to any community, and that's what they do. That is commodity news. We can hire one person in Washington to write a trend story about something that's going on, and then all of our papers across the country can run it because there's some connection there locally. People will get it. Hyperlocal news would be going out and talking to people in our community who are dealing with this issue, dealing with that trend, talking to subject matter experts in our communities who have opinions or takes on that trend, talking to local doctors, whoever it might be. It is putting a local face on stories. It is talking about the impact that it has in your neighborhood, on your street. It's not commodity news. And because of that, it has far more value to it. So to me, hyperlocal news is covering our high schools, covering youth sports, covering, and when I say high schools, I mean every aspect of our high schools. Yes, there are national trends around education in high schools and the unique issues that A3 and Springfield and Thurston and Crestwell and Cottage Grove and Pleasant Hill are facing are different from those things. And so being able to tell those stories to me is what differentiates what hyperlocal news is. If you talk to people in New York, they'll say the New York Times is their local newspaper. Who thinks of the New York Times as a local paper? But people love their paper, they have that connection, and they think of their paper as their local paper. Even if the Register Guard came back to a fraction of the great paper it used to be, it's probably never going to be going deep into Springfield, Crestwell, and Cottage Grove to serve those communities anymore. And so it could be a good local paper for Eugene again, I suppose, but it will never be the local paper for these communities again. That ship has sailed. And to me, I see that as opportunity. I see that as green grass in front of me. To go out and serve these communities, tell these stories, and hopefully local businesses see the value in that too and can have a business model that sustains that kind of coverage.
Yeah, I'm going to throw another term into the equation or into the conversation, and that is something that some of my colleagues at the University of Oregon have been doing a lot of work on, and that is talking about community-centered journalism. Which really is another way of saying what Noel just said, which is you need journalism that is in the community, that is of the community, and that cares about the community. And so as there is some research my colleagues have reported that shows, quote, audiences don't want local news outlets to be watchdogs, just to be watchdogs. They want them to be good neighbors too. All right, they want local journalism that cares about the community, that knows the community. And having worked in community journalism for a while, there is no greater pressure than if you know that story you wrote today, you're going to have to walk into the coffee shop tomorrow morning, and the people you wrote about are going to be sitting there. So you've got to care about your community and know your community. You're not the New York Times, Bigfooting in or parachuting in and doing a story on your community. You're somebody who lives there and is part of that community.
I'm going to piggyback off that too. I think one more phrase or something that maybe it's more of a mindset that we try to keep as we do work, and we're able to do this on a hyper-local level, I think, more effectively. And that is solution-oriented journalism. When you're in the community, when you're community-focused, you're able to approach news coverage in a way that could edify and uplift the community as opposed to simply shining that spotlight on it or shining the spotlight on the problem. It is a different way of reporting that I think is frankly healthier to the community.
Well, I'll ask another question. So both of you have extensive experience in journalism. How do you see the evolving role of journalists in the context of hyperlocal news, community engagement, and ethical reporting? Tim, I'll let you go first.
Well, I'm not sure that the role of the journalist changes. The way he or she does the job may change a little bit in terms of the way a story gets shaped. May change, but basic fact-based journalism is fact-based journalism, and trying as best as you can to present an accurate story, an accurate representation of the facts, understanding that we all have biases of one kind or another, and you have to try to, in one way or another, report in a way that is not skewed by those biases, but you're still trying to simply present the facts in a way that makes sense to your community and that helps the community move forward in whatever the issue is.
Noel, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, as Tim says, the behavior and the ethics that the reporter or editor acts upon never changes, right? The standards are there in terms of the way that you do and the way that you report things out. Not to embarrass her, Amanda Laurie is here, one of our reporters, and in the last couple of weeks, she has followed a story about a Lane County commissioner that was under some investigation on an ethics charge. And she reported that. I think we played it appropriately inside the paper in that early stage. And then ultimately he was cleared, and she wrote that story, wrapping things up. And the amount of feedback that we got from readers around that story, complimenting her, including the main subjects, for playing it straight, for simply reporting the facts, was kind of laughable to us. We were surprised at how much positive feedback we got, really, for just doing the basics and the fundamentals. Kudos to Amanda for accurate reporting, but all she did was her job, accurately reporting things. But people notice that, and they care about that, and that is what differentiates us. People say to me sometimes, what's the difference between you and the what's going on in Springfield page on Facebook? Well, there's a significant difference, right? We're credible journalists, and as Tim said right up front, that credibility that we bring to the news is what separates us and differentiates us. There's no hate speech around our content, right? There's no offensive advertising that pops up around our content. There's a family newspaper, and the content is vetted and adheres to journalistic standards, and those things make a difference.
Thank you. So I'm gonna ask another question. More and more newly hired journalists in Eugene and Springfield are straight out of college. With this dynamic, how have you managed the lack of experience or subsequent turnover rate once they gain experience and move on? We see this very commonly in news where, you know, someone they get up to speed and they've got their skills kind of polished, and then they move on to that bigger market. How is that? How do you handle that?
I would just say it would be great if the Chronicle developed a reputation as a place that launches careers. Come on in. There's tons of great stuff to cover in these communities, and you can absolutely get the experience to grow your career and go somewhere else. That's okay. We live with that.
Well, I would say that, I mean, the concern is very accurate. And one of the results of the last 15 years of journalism nationally has been the loss of institutional memory. So no matter what news organization you're talking about, the knowledge in the newsroom about the community is substantially less than it used to be. This is even more true in television than it is in print. But it is a serious problem, and I don't know that there's a solution for it other than becoming that place that is known as a good launching pad, especially in smaller communities, because that's what journalists do. They're going to move from small markets to larger markets, generally speaking. And you just have to hope that you've got, especially in your editors, and you've got some seniority in your newsroom that can help new journalists learn the community. I mean, we all have, having been covered a fair amount in my life by journalists. As I've said to many people, every journalist should have to have a story written about him or herself. It's a very sobering moment.
Yeah. I've made a comment that, you know, it seems as soon as they learn how to pronounce the name right, then they are moving on. You all know what I'm talking about. So how do hyper-local news outlets maintain journalistic standards for objectivity and fairness?
There's nothing different I'm doing here than what I've done at every newspaper I've worked at across the country, regardless of size, right? It goes back to, you know, Society of Professional Journalists Ethics Code and the way that we behave and do our business. You know, it requires a different level of coaching and engagement, perhaps, with younger entry-level employees sometimes, but that's what we do and who we are. If we lose that kind of credibility, then we've lost everything. So it can be challenging, right? In a smaller community too, where people want to do nice things for you, and you have to say, no, I can't accept that, I can't take that. But that's an education process that you have to do anywhere. So those kinds of things don't change anywhere, from my perspective and experience. You have to be above reproach.
Well, I think I would agree completely. But at the same time, I think it's important that we understand that that the kind of the ecosystem has changed, and especially with social media and the blurring of lines between what is journalism and what is social media, and what, just kind of it's a much messier world that we live in today. I think the general culture has changed in ways that make it more difficult to walk that journalistic line of and to write stories that are free of any sort of bias to the extent that they can be. And it's especially hard because a lot of people believe that can't be done.
Yeah.
And that debate makes it very challenging, I think, especially for younger journalists. But the bottom line still is, if you're doing journalism, you're writing providing fact-based information, and you're doing it in a way that is as devoid of any sort of ideological or political or any other kind of bias as it possibly can be.
To amplify that a little bit, we're nonpartisan. We don't recommend individuals for office. We don't cover party-specific events if the Republicans or the Democrats are doing something. We allow anybody that has earned their way onto a ballot to write a guest column stating their platform. And of course, we cover the blocking and tackling of elections, the basics, but we don't get involved in partisan coverage. However, right, people look at the stories that we do cover in our newspaper and they draw inferences from that and say, oh, well, they're covering this issue, they must be this. And so it's very hard to present yourself truly as this, arbiter, non-biased arbiter on every issue. You just have to work hard at making sure that you're providing as much balance as possible in those scenarios. And in terms of news judgment and the pressure that the internet and social media puts on things these days, there's a lot of talk right now about Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce as a very popular pop culture couple. And I remember when I was at the Dallas Morning News, in fact, we did what we called every morning there a stand-up meeting. And so all the sports editors of different oversights would get together and we talked about what we thought might make the cover that night for the morrow's paper. And we were going around and then somebody came up and said, hey, we just heard that Tony Romo, the Cowboys quarterback, is dating Jessica Simpson. So this is all, all new to me, old again. So deja vu. And we're standing around and we're thinking, well, that's not a story. Who cares that Tony Romo is dating Jessica Simpson? That's ridiculous. And so this would have been 2004 or 5-ish. And somebody said, yeah, it's a talker.
Yeah.
And so now all of a sudden, for the first time, I'm standing in a major daily newsroom and the justification for putting a story on the front page was, it's a talker. There's no news value to it other than it's gossipy, interesting. And so that is a big factor in terms of news judgment and how you play stories. And then I would have my Cowboys beat reporter coming in and said, hey, I've talked to a couple of people. I don't have anyone on the record. I know this is happening, but I can't report it yet based on our standards. And meanwhile, it's all over the internet that it's happening. So I'm looking like I'm getting beat on this story. How can we get this out to people? And as of right now, we get it out by reporting it the way we report it. Get 2 sources off the record or 1 source on the record. Let's go.
Do you all find that there's I'm curious, I'm asking, this is off script. Just last night, we were having a conversation with a 14-year-old daughter and asking her, you know, she's on social media all the time, kind of asking her, how does she determine that something is factual? Because kids are exposed to so much stuff these days. And you know, my husband shares that, well, you know, in his childhood, it was like, well, if it's in print, it's got to be factual. But now, of course, and I'm just kind of wondering what your thoughts are on kind of the checks and balances to that, because I think it's really hard to figure out, you know, what's fake news. And, you know, I'm curious about just kind of what you guys see as, you know, how do readers know? How can they really tell? And what's the checks and balances?
Well, there are all sorts of kind of techniques that one can be taught. Okay, this is how you verify it, you know, and that if it's, you know, is a story too good to be true? If that's so, it probably isn't. You know, and triangulating and having more sources and looking at something and making sure that it's not just one source that's providing this information. And that's all well and good. And for most of the people in this room anyway, at least the older of us and the people, we think that's fine. That's how we're going to figure out how news works and how to verify information. But that's not the reality of the social media world. Or then, you know, I have a 24-year-old daughter who's very well informed, and I have no idea how. You know, but it is a matter of verifying sources. I mean, that's really all you can do. And whether it's using traditional means of verifying those sources or other means, you have to be able to verify your sources are accurate and go with it. Unfortunately, you know, we live in a world of you know, news of assertion as opposed to news, as opposed to fact-based news. And that's certainly true in the online world. Not only assertion, but the immediate jump to conclusion that is what we see every day. And well, I mean, the example that we're all struggling with today, which is what did happen in Gaza?
Yeah.
And you see the news organizations trying to figure out what actually did happen, whose version of the story is true. But you also see a good portion of the world who is not at all interested in verifying the truth. They know the truth because they believe what they read or what they heard. So it's a very hard question and a very challenging one.
Yeah.
It requires a lot of work. You can't just say, well, that's my paper and I sort of grew up and I trust it and everyone I know trusts it. Today, it requires a lot of work. There are tools out there, but it requires the consumer to go out there and verify and vet themselves and look for third-party sources that they trust that can help verify the validity of reporting. It just requires a lot more work today, but there are those tools and resources out there to find the credible information.
Right. So next question. So from your experiences, can you share examples of how community members have actively supported and benefited from hyperlocal news, and maybe what lessons we can draw from those examples? It's kind of a stumper.
Well, we've done an awful lot of reporting that I think has informed the community and made the community, or at least put people in a position to better understand issues, whether that's voting on them, whether that's showing up at a public meeting and making comment. And I think there's probably lots of examples of that. We've seen some very, very active public meetings around issues like homelessness, for instance, in Cottage Grove and here. Public safety in Springfield certainly has generated a lot of interest at public meetings, and we've covered a lot of that. So I just think that from that alone, in terms of broadly connecting folks across the community around key issues, that's been a significant value. And I say this all the time, anecdotally, I've never worked anywhere where I've received as much feedback from the community about how much value they find in what we're doing. They're so appreciative. I think some of that comes from the broken heart of seeing what's happened to the Register Guard. It's impossible to sell an ad or get a subscriber who doesn't say to us at the same time how much they miss what the Register Guard used to be. And then that's true of every community in America. It's everywhere I've worked, I've heard those things. But I've never heard from people in these smaller communities this sort of outpouring of thank you for doing this. And we see it in terms of, you know, our business model, of course, we think we have unique and differentiating content because we cover things that nobody else covers. And we think readers like that, and we think advertisers like that. And we think that's a business model that can succeed. We've certainly had some challenges with COVID. And so last month we launched a nonprofit very specifically dedicated to making sure that we have resources to cover education in these communities and the broader nonprofit community at large. Lane County has more nonprofits per capita than any other community in the state of Oregon, maybe outside of Seattle, the entire West. So there's a lot to cover here. And, you know, volunteerism, the need for sweat equity and money and goods and time is tremendous. And so we've created a foundation where people can make tax deductible donations. There's another potential revenue stream for us to serve the community at large. Chronicle1909.com. It has a donate button on the front. Really easy. So I think shining a spotlight on things that otherwise wouldn't get the attention brings tremendous value, and that connectivity across these communities brings great value. Again, we hear from people that say, I grew up in Cottage Grove, I live in Eugene, my mom's in Crestwell now, my cousin's in Pleasant Hill. There's this hand in glove relationship with all of these little communities around Eugene. And people respond to that sort of holistic coverage.
Well, I'll just give you one recent example that comes to mind, and that is, as some of you will know, we had a very important school board election in Eugene recently, in 4J. A school board election. So what? It was incredibly important for that school district, and the weekly, actually no one would have known anything about the candidates had it not been for what the weekly did. I mean, the weekly did a really good piece on the school board election. And for me, that's congratulations to the weekly for doing it. And not only did they do it, but they also endorsed in a way that made some of their readers unhappy. But what's most concerning to me is the fact that we don't know what else happened in Eugene or Springfield, in Lane County in the last 6 months that we just don't know about. And that's the scary part of it all. But I think that was a great example of, hyper-local journalism. We're going to cover a school board race, and we're going to cover it well. And KLCC also did some reporting on it as well. But I think that, and as to benefit, we as a community benefit when we know these things, when we can make informed decisions and we know what's going on in our communities. Every one of us does.
Yeah, incredibly important. I want to ask a question kind of around the funding model. You touched on this a little bit, Tim, in your intro, but I'm kind of curious what you all think is sustainable as far as how, in an age where folks are so accustomed to accessing free information, and they people don't want to pay for, I can't tell you how many times I've clicked on something and gone to a page in the Oregonian or something else, and they want you to subscribe, and then oftentimes you're like, well, move on. I'm curious what you feel is kind of sustainable and acceptable that the market is. Are we moving towards a sponsorship type of model, or do we feel that people are gonna, be okay with with paying for content that, I'm just kind of curious what you're seeing out there.
Well, I mean, I'll take the big picture and I'll jump in on more locally. I started saying, many of you will remember when the phrase information wants to be free was kind of very popular thing. And what I used to say, especially to students, was, well, information wants to be free, but journalists need to pay the rent. So the idea that free information can be free is a bad idea if you're trying to have a healthy journalism ecosystem or a healthy civic culture. It's also the case, so the way in which journalism was funded for the better part of the 20th century and there was simply with basically advertising supported journalism primarily, a combination of advertising and subscribers. That's how journalism was funded. When the internet came along and suddenly we disentangled news content from advertising content. In other words, you no longer needed news content to get your advertising out there. That created the crisis that we're currently in. So the model that is beginning to develop with some success is really a kind of a combination of three elements. The advertising and subscriber revenue continues to be a very important piece of the puzzle for mainstream journalism. In addition to that, you begin to look at philanthropic support. And so you're seeing more and more news organizations that are getting, I mean, Noel can talk about it in very specifically, setting up a foundation to try to raise money to do specific things. Or you have organizations like ProPublica that are entirely funded by philanthropic efforts that are doing great investigative work. So it's a combination of revenue from advertisers, from subscribers, and from philanthropy that is probably what we're going to end up going forward. So we're going to have this hybrid model. It's not going to be just one or the other. And so as I said 15 years ago at a public radio meeting, public radio and public television are no longer unique. Everybody's seeking subscribers and philanthropic support. But it's a mixture of those three things that's going to support journalism going forward.
It's probably no surprise with my background, the way I came up, is that I'd always heard in my career that content was king. And I still believe that. And if you have the content that people care about, you can drive revenue around that. You can monetize that. And if you have the ability to really capture that unique and differentiating content yourself, then that is a business model that will work. People will pay for the content they care about. Yes, it's a roadblock many times when you click on a link and you go to a site and, oh, I got to register, I got to pay for it. And I know there's a lot of talk in our industry about disinformation is free, but the truth is behind a paywall. But to Tim's point, I have to pay rent and I have to pay my staff, and it's not cheap. Why do these large VC companies that are buying up newspapers, and why does Gannett and these large corporate chains own all this? It's because they want to commoditize and find efficient ways to make money on that content. And it is much cheaper to hire one person to write a story for your 50 papers than 50 reporters in local communities. So I'm not taking the most cost-effective approach to trying to gather news and engage with our community. I'm taking a really important approach, I think, to gather unique and differentiating content that is compelling and important to the community. And I think readers will respond to that. And I think businesses will respond to that. And as far as that sort of three-legged stool, advertising revenue, circulation revenue, subscription revenue, and now sort of revenue through the nonprofit, right? So particularly in a small community like this, and I'll put it in air quotes, Springfield's not a tiny little rural town, but a smaller community. There are big industries here. There are very successful businesses here. Olson Industrial Electric is huge. It's $1 billion a year global company. They've got no need to advertise in the Chronicle, right? That's kind of silly. But the CEO of Olson Electric might find a lot of value in his community where his business is based, having a local newspaper shining a spotlight on education and nonprofits and local government and things of that nature. So what's a way for them to get involved in supporting the paper? Maybe they can sponsor something. Maybe they can donate to the nonprofit that drives education and other nonprofit coverage. So that's what we want to do, is open up as many lanes of revenue traffic as possible for people to meet the community's needs. And there's other manufacturers in our community that have no need to advertise a product, but might see the value in supporting local news.
Let me add another leg to that stool, which is one that doesn't get much attention and it's somewhat controversial, but that is the whole question of tax advantage for journalism businesses. Which actually, if you look at the history of newspapers in the United States and you actually look at the current postal code, you will see tax advantages are written in for newspapers and have been historically, literally from the founding of the nation to the present. There has been some tax advantage for journalism. And there's more and more discussion about, as we look at the health of communities and the need for healthy journalistic presence in these communities, should there be some sort of tax structure that supports journalism? It's an interesting idea, and again, beginning to get more, and in some, and you do find in some countries, especially in Scandinavian countries, where there's a very high, a very strong system of tax incentives and governmental support for journalism.
I'm going to ask one last question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience here. So be thinking of a question. But I am curious as to how you both feel about how the community, as individuals, as businesses and whatnot, can actively support and engage with, our local news outlets to ensure that we continue to have this high quality resource for our news. What can we do?
I think there's a lot to do, right? There's so many different entry points to your local newspaper. And as much as we love our print product, our weekly newspaper, and there are people that love that too, we have many other products and platforms, right? We have a website online. We're very active on Facebook and Instagram, on social media. We do video and audio that we place digitally. We do newsletters that come right into your inbox. So there are a lot of different ways of engaging and getting information out there. So you can contribute to your newspaper by encouraging your favorite store owners to advertise in the paper. You can take out an ad. You can subscribe. You can buy a gift subscription. You can submit information to the paper, right? We run listings and calendar listings and event listings, all sorts of things. There's a lot of different ways to get in there. We have some very low barriers for entry in terms of advertising. Classified, $7 for 20 words. So there's a lot of different ways to engage. Just calling and telling us you heard about something that's coming up and asking if we might be interested in covering that. Submitting a photo that you took on your morning walk that was amazing. There are lots of different ways to touch base with us. And I think that's about 90% of it, is just reaching out and having that sort of daily conversation. We also host events like forums on specific topics, so partner with different organizations to host public forums. So there's an awful lot of ways to do that. And, story ideas are always welcome. You may be more interesting than you realize, and you may know people that are more interesting than you might realize. So don't hesitate to tell us about somebody that you know that is going to the New York Dog Show from Springfield with their 2 dogs. That's a great local story.
I think first of all, I think that there's an obligation on the part of the news organization, and you're hearing the kinds of things that the Chronicle's doing to be engaged in the community and to be an active member of the community. But I think the bigger question isn't how do we get people to pay attention to journalism, it's how do we build a strong civic culture? How do we get people in communities, and this is preaching to the choir sitting here at the City Club, but how do we get people in the community to actually care about the community and think it's important to care about the community, and that they need to be engaged in what's going on in civic life in their community? I mean, look at voting participation. You know, what percentage of the population votes? It's a very telling number of a sense of disengagement. So how do we turn that around? And journalism is part of that, and local newspapers, community newspapers being in the community and of the community is a critical piece of that puzzle.
Yeah. We actually have 2 questions from Facebook.
Okay, Len, I'll let you ask them.
First question from Facebook, it's directed to you, Noel, but it's actually for both of you. Tim's point is exactly right about people not caring about the truth. How can you get people to believe the truth?
Wow.
That's for you, Noel.
That really is a great question, right?
Yeah.
Nobody is going to trust by default. And so for us, it's a matter of living up to the ideals that we espouse. We have enough out there now. I've owned the paper since February of 2019. Are we perfect? Absolutely not. And we're happy to run, not happy, but we run errors and omissions and clarifications all the time in our products. Maybe not all the time. I don't want to overstate it, but we're happy to do those things. And hopefully we build that credibility over time as we report, as we engage with sources, as they see how they're quoted, as they see the context that we present news and information. That's how you build the trust. I don't think there's any shortcut to it. You've got to look at our output and our consistency. I'd like to think that our motivations are pure. But nevertheless, we're also flawed humans that make mistakes. But hopefully, over time, our reporting is what establishes trust.
Ditto.
Yeah.
We can go to another question. Go ahead, Lee.
A question for Noel. What's the proportion of your subscribers that are electronic versus print?
We have many more print subscribers than we do electronic. Now, we do offer something called limited articles online, which a lot of people take us up on. So there are hundreds and hundreds of people that sign up for limited articles. It's our job, obviously, to try to convert those people into longer-term subscribers digitally. We do offer them a $6 a month per month digital subscription. And then a slightly cheaper subscription for the course of the year. But we do have a lot of folks that follow us temporarily online. We have a few hundred subscribers monthly or annually digitally, but most of our readership is still the print product. One thing that's interesting about the print product is that the fastest growing area for subscriptions to the print product is Eugene. We don't cover Eugene. Our North Star is hyper local. We cover people in these little communities around Eugene. But back to my point that all these communities interact, right? These people that live in these communities work in Eugene, and people that live in Eugene recreate in these communities. So people are interested, even though we're not covering Eugene, folks in Eugene are interested in what's happening in these communities around them.
How big is your reporting staff?
What's that?
How big is your reporting staff?
So we have 2 full-time reporters. We have about a dozen correspondents and freelancers. We have an executive editor, and Aaron Tierney Heggenstaller, who's been here with the Chronicle for about 10 years. So we go back to that sort of thing, that personnel issue that a lot of small newspapers deal with, which is mostly entry-level folks. I'm very fortunate to have somebody who's mid-career in a senior in a senior role with our newspaper, who brings that institutional knowledge and that journalism, professionalism to help grow and train and develop younger reporters.
John?
So I want to go back a little bit to the trust issue. No, I really appreciate the role that the Chronicle plays in that and being the local focus in that. But the trust issue transcends those things. And as certainly Tim, and as you know, even amongst colleagues that I work with, there's a lack of trust for multiple reasons. So I'm trying to understand, so what role both can the Chronicle play, even in the limited ability you have to cover local, versus what can we do longer term with all the misinformation's out there, the confusing information that creates this distrust or mistrust that's going on. And let me just say, I would prefer to read the newspaper every day. I'm old. That's my source, but I can. But thank you for what you do.
Well, I think on the trust issue, all that news organizations can do is just to continue to put out fact-based information and as best as possible, and try to convince people that what they're doing is accurate and stand by and be as transparent as possible. I mean, one of the problems with journalism and many other things is that people don't have the faintest idea what you do or how you do it. And this would be true whether you're talking about a journalist or you're talking about a legislator. People don't know how these institutions work. So the more you can be out there and transparent about what you're doing and how you're doing it and explaining it to people, the more likely you are to convince them that in fact what you're doing is honest and truthful. But that doesn't even begin to address the larger problem that I don't know that anyone has an answer for, which is we live in a world of assertion, and we also live in a world where people tend to live in echo chambers, and they hear, and we all do this. I mean, we all hear something, and it corresponds to what we think. Therefore, we believe it's true. So it's not a unique problem or an easy one to solve.
Yeah, the issue today, it seems, that exacerbates all of this is that there's so much misinformation, so much disinformation, right? That's what makes it so tough. The fewer sources there were, you could sort of do a better job of sort of figuring out what their motivations were. But today, with AI and deep fakes coming, it's only going to be more and more difficult to discern the truth. And there's obviously a much more hostile environment today too that we're reporting in, right? I've never thought of myself as an enemy of the people. The correlation between what the Chronicle does and what CNN does, I mean, it's night and day. They're not the same businesses. They're not the same editorial or philosophical approach to business. I think as a hyper-local business, it almost is easier for me and my team because we're out there amongst you guys, right? You're not, try to reach somebody at USA Today. We're accessible. We're in the community. And so that sort of raises the stakes on us to get it right. As Tim says, you got to show up the next day to the people that you're writing about every day. You don't want to get that wrong. So I think for us, it's a matter of showing up. And the other thing that Tim says, I mean, this has been an issue for as long as I've been in the industry. There's been major efforts nationally with APSE and ASNE, all these national journalism organizations to figure out the credibility and trust issue. And transparency always comes out as sort of the number one thing as a way to deal with this. Tell the reader how you got it wrong or what you're doing to get it right. Explain your process. When would you use an anonymous source and when wouldn't you use one? But that kind of transparency about our process is an important part of it.
Another question from Facebook. This one's even more difficult to answer than the first one. When discussing tax benefits for the press, the writer puts it in quotes, how do you differentiate between legitimate press and propaganda press?
So, good question. There's a couple of ways that things differentiate structurally in our industry. Tim mentioned he has been on the ONPA board. I'm an active member of the ONPA board, the Oregon Newspaper Publishers Association. And so that board does a lot of work to try to separate the line between what is legitimate journalism and what is not legitimate. The U.S. Postal Service has standards that you have to meet, or they will classify you as a periodical. You have to have a certain amount of editorial content and a certain amount of advertising content in every edition to justify that, so that you're not just a flyer or just a mouthpiece of something. So there are different things in the industry that require us that would differentiate us as a journalistic publication versus just a one-sided mouthpiece.
Yeah, so I mean, this is an issue that has been front and center, especially in areas not having to do with taxes, but having to do with public records, and also having to do with journalistic privilege as a legal protection. And they're basically two ways to go about it. One is kind of the credential way, which is, you belong to an organization, you have so many reporters, you publish on a brief such and such a basis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The other is a functional analysis that basically says, is this an organization that is publishing information or gathering information to inform the public? Which is a much harder and squishier credential or way to get to it. But those are basically the two different ways that you can use. And neither one of them is perfect. And we would be more likely, which is what we already do in the postal area, is use the kind of credential model for determining who's a legitimate news organization.
All right, well, I've got about 2 minutes left. Does anybody have a burning question? We have time.
Well, we have a question from Zoom.
Okay.
It's much too long for me to read it in its entirety, so I will not even try to do that. But the thrust of the question is there's a growing gap between the haves and the have-nots in this society. And the questioner wants to know, how can we provide important civic information to the whole community so that it's available to everyone and not just those who have disposable income to pay for a subscription?
So, yeah, newspaper's an odd product. It does have a significant social community value to it. And we invest money into doing things at the paper that are good for the community, whether it's necessarily good for our bottom line. But we are a for-profit business. We do have products. We do have bills to pay and taxes to pay. And it's kind of odd to hear people not wanting to pay for products that cost money to produce. There's very few businesses that we would ever walk into a brick and mortar building and say, hey, give it to me for free. So it is unfortunate. There is information in our paper that is widely available publicly too. I think one of the things of real value that we bring is curated information, right? Oh, that's on the internet. I could find that. Sure. Go spend an hour searching through 1.5 billion results to get the one piece of information you need. Or you can pick up the paper and there's a curated list to your interest in our local community of what's going on. There's value to that too. That's not all that unique in terms of the information itself, but the curation is value. Somebody has been paid to think critically about that content and add value to it in a way that makes it easier and saves you time. So I wish we could just give it away, but I can't. It's a product that costs money to produce, and it's pretty inexpensive in light of everything else. You get a lot of value, a lot of bang for your buck.
Okay. But I think the questioner that raises really the fundamental question that we need to be looking at in every community, and that is, how do we build a healthy civic culture? And clearly, you don't have a healthy civic culture if the cost of a newspaper or the cost of whatever it is precludes a significant portion of the population being able to get information. So how you get to that answer, I'm not sure, but it's a conversation that we should be having. And it involves government, it involves philanthropy, it involves for-profit, it involves everyone in the community figuring out how do we solve this problem. And it's not simply this is not simply a newspaper problem. I mean, think about where you get information. I mean, is the internet, this is actually the FCC is about to look at this question in a little more detail. Is the internet a utility? Is it a public utility? I mean, can you function in this society without good internet access? Or is it like water? And if it is a utility, then how do you make sure that you've got community access to it? I mean, it's a big question, but I think it is the fundamental question.
Hopefully your local library has a subscription to the Chronicle, and you get it a day late, but you can go read it at your local library. The other thing that we do, for instance, during COVID, or wildfires, if there is compelling public interest and public safety involved in it, we make those things free. We don't put those behind the paywall on the internet.
All right, well, thank you both so much for joining us today. And you perfectly teed off my next comments. We're just letting our members